Okay.
All yours, Hannah. Take it away.
All right. So, hi, everybody. I was just saying to Tom that I've not done actual presentations on Zoom. So this is my first one, though I do a lot of supervision and I do therapy, of course, on Zoom. So hopefully it'll go without a hitch. So I'm just going to introduce myself first. My name is Hannah Rockman, and I am the principal of York Region Psychological Services. So how did I start? Well, as you can see, that I was, when I was young, I was a veteran in the Israeli Defense Force. And that was my first exposure to working with or experiencing trauma, really. Not only amongst colleagues, but also living in Israel, there's a fair amount of trauma around. And then over the years, I studied, and now, as you can see on the right, I have a clinic that's about half of our staff. And we work with a lot of first responders and also individual clients. We work with the people who have experienced trauma, both through their work and through various either work accidents or motor vehicle accidents. We also now run groups. We've just finished first responders wives or partners group, and that was a 10-week group, and then we had another one for 14 weeks, and we are now thinking of starting a third group for partners and also for couples. And so keep that in mind. If you have any first responders who you feel would benefit, please ask them to email us. So what are we going to do today? We're going to start with just going over the general DSM-5 criteria for PTSD. And then we're going to look at prevalence generally and particularly amongst police officers. We're going to look at the risk factors and protective factors and the police culture and stigma and what stops people from getting help. And when is it time to suggest somebody gets professional help, as well as the kind of treatments we provide. There will be room for time for questions and answers at the end, but if you have any during the presentation, feel free to stop me. I have no problems with that. I think the best thing to do, I won't be able to really read the chat, but I know that Tom and Jennifer will be reading it, so they will alert me to any questions that need to be answered during the presentation. So let's start with the DSM diagnosis. So for PTSD diagnosis, there has to be foremost the criteria A, which would mean exposure to trauma. Now, most of us have been exposed to some kind of trauma in our life, be it an accident or relationship breakups or parents leaving or divorce, lots and lots of trauma, once we reach over 20 at least. But not all of these would qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So how do we know if it's trauma or is it a qualifying diagnosis for post-traumatic stress? So as I said, the first criteria would be a direct exposure to trauma, either you're feeling that your life is threatened or that somebody you love, their life is threatened or they're going to be seriously injured. In cases of sexual assault, they don't necessarily have to believe they're going to die, but that would also qualify as a criteria A. Another way to experience being exposed to it is witnessing a person that this is occurring to, or learning about it, learning of trauma of a close family member, or violence toward a close family member, or experiencing repeated extreme exposure to trauma. And that's something that is very common amongst police officers, for example, people who repeatedly have to collect human remains or need to view child abuse videos day in, day out, or often people who are taking calls and have to stay online with the caller repeatedly, and that eventually the culmination can lead to post-traumatic stress. Now, in terms of exposure through media, that often people say, I watched this movie, or I saw a documentary about an avalanche or something, but that does not qualify. It has to be either exposure to somebody you know, or watching it yourself, or having experienced it yourself. The second criteria is B, which the criteria of intrusion, and you would have to have one or more of the following intrusion criteria happening after the event. So memories of the event, intrusive memories of the event, recurrent distressing dreams of the event, or the affect of the event. So you wake up feeling really scared, although you may not actually remember the dream. Dissociative reactions, which would be things like flashbacks, actually believing that you're in the traumatic event itself, as if it's recurring. And this could be on a continuum from sort of for a second thinking, if you hear a door bang, thinking, oh my God, somebody's shooting, to actually completely being unaware of your surroundings and completely dissociating. And marked emotional reactions to internal or external cues. So internal could be memories and thoughts, and external could be things like smells or pictures or incidents of somebody talking or something you see on television. The thing is that often people go to extreme lengths to avoid feeling or seeing or being exposed to anything that may remind them of the trauma. And you will find this in the avoidance criteria, which is the next one. So they will just really make a lot of effort to avoid thinking about it or talking about it, or avoid external reminders. For example, they might not want to go, if it's a police officer, often I hear my patients saying that they don't want to go near the police station, or if somebody comes to visit them, they ask them not to come in uniform. One of my clients, she cut up all her husband's uniforms. She had worked in the police, and his uniforms triggered her, so she cut them up. And then there's the criteria D, which would be negative alterations to cognition and mood. So you'd have to have at least two of the following. So you'd have to have inability to remember important aspects of the trauma. You could have a vague, sometimes you might have just a vague recollection, and that's problematic, especially when if it goes to court. And you saw this in the Gian Gomeshi's case, that because the victims of the trauma didn't remember everything about it, that weakened their case. But this is often the case. People just don't remember aspects of it because of the trauma. And then persistent or exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself. And so, or others. So somehow you feel that like nobody can be trusted, and the world is very dangerous. And so these are not necessarily rational thoughts, but they can be very exaggerated. And they may have a grain of truth in them, but they generally much more blown out of proportion than would be expected under normal circumstances. And then also there's distorted thoughts about misplaced blame. So somehow I'm responsible for this person's death, or my supervisors had done something and that's what caused it. And then there's negative emotional states. So feelings of fear and horror, and a diminished interest in things that they used to enjoy. They just can't be bothered. Everything just seems like too much of an effort. And feelings of detachment and estrangement from others. So people feel like they feel like they can't connect to anybody, and they just feel that they have difficulty, as if they're behind the screen somehow. They feel like, and the last one is inability to experience positive emotions. Sometimes they just feel numb. They often report feeling emotionally sort of dead, unable to love, not being interested in other people. And also that sense of a foreshortened future, that somehow they think that they or somebody they love will not live as long as they expected them to live. So the fifth and final sort of main category is the symptom of hyperarousal. And that takes various forms, like irritability, reckless or destructive or risk-taking behavior, being hypervigilant, constantly being on guard. You'll often hear police officers say they never sit with their back to the door. An exaggerated startle response, or the phone rings and like jump, and difficulty concentrating, not due to any kind of head injury, of course. And sleep disturbances, can't fall asleep, but they keep waking up, and it's very difficult for them to relax. So these are the main criteria. Of course, in addition to that, they have to be there for more than a month, and they have to cause a significant impairment in their functioning, because if they don't, then you could say it's not really a disorder, it's just symptoms that they are experiencing, but they don't affect their behavior. So it doesn't really matter. And with regard to the prevalence, there have been some studies done, and they found that there was one study that was done in Canada, and they found that people who, they studied more than 5,000 people in the study, and they found that out of those, 30 to 50% of those exposed to trauma experience acute stress response. That would be less than a month at any rate. And out of those, 50% experience chronic PTSD. So not all acute distress will translate to PTSD, but they will 50% of those will. And of first responders, they have a greater risk of PTSD. They found that 15% experience at least one mental health disorder, and 26 will have several mental health disorders. And 20% of police officers suffer from PTSD. But unfortunately, only 55% of those receive any information or education about PTSD. And of those, only 13% will actually sought treatment. So, the problem is that a lot of people find that they or describe the way they describe PTSD is that they feel that they sort of separated, as if they're looking at the world through a telescope that's upside down. Everything seems very far away and small. And these are symptoms that we don't often, partly because it's difficult to understand what it means for people and to describe it, but often we don't ask about those directly. And that's one of the questions we need to ask is, do you feel that you're losing track of things, that you're sort of zoning out. And sometimes it's just a very brief zoning out, but sometimes they completely disassociate and they like in a sort of blackout, although they appear to be talking and they're not asleep, obviously. And so it's really important to ask people, do you feel that you're disconnected? Do you feel that you're sort of behind a wall, or that you can't reach people? And so the thing is that, as we said, a lot of people experience various traumas. And if people respond to trauma with anxiety and they have enough support and space to work through their feelings, they don't necessarily need treatment. On the other hand, the people who feel completely overwhelmed and full of terror and are dissociating, they definitely need to be at least assessed for treatment. So what are the triggers for PTSD? And this is primarily, we're talking about police officers. The first one is trauma that is related to children, okay? And if you ask first responders, the worst day on their job, they almost unanimously defer to a situation involving a child, because the nature of a police officer's job is to protect the public, and especially when it's a child who everybody sees as an innocent, pure person who's not is just there by chance. And this is something that will stay with police officers for many, many years and haunt them. And it's a very, very stressful situation, because not only do they have to deal with the situation at hand, but they also have to deal with the fallout. And when they're on the scene, they have to do many jobs, like they have to be a grief counselor, a social worker, they have to deal with the family. And police officers cannot meet all these requirements. They just about can function on the job, especially when it's so traumatic. And many officers report a much higher level of stress associated with incidents involving children. And they will feel guilty and traumatized for many, many years after this happens. And we often see, for example, when there was that incident with Musso, that driver who was drunk and killed the family, there was many years of fallout for the first responders dealing with that scene. So you can imagine if it happens to civilians, more so the people who are directly related to the scene itself. Another issue is chronic fatigue. Now, you might not think that being tired can cause trauma, but it's not direct cause. But what happens is, if you think about the effects of chronic fatigue, stress is one of the effects of that. And also, when you're not sleeping, sometimes it's very difficult to make rational decisions under pressure. And what happens when you make a mistake under pressure and you're a police officer, that will often cost lives. Whereas if we make a mistake at work, or if you work in an office, it's not going to be so critical. But what happens if your judgment is impaired and your decision making is impacted, then that's going to be a very costly mistake that can then trigger PTSD. Another trigger is officers involved in shootings. And many officers will not discharge their service weapon while on duty at all, but it is the reality of the job. And there is a high percentage of police officers that suffer from PTSD who have been involved in shootings, either being shot at or taking somebody else's life and feeling responsible. And one of the reasons, for example, in the military, that they limit how many times people go on to combat zones is because there is it's not something that we as human beings are capable of managing very easily. And so most people will not want to shoot anybody unless it's absolutely the last resort. And so the feelings associated with having to discharge their weapon in the line of duty can play in their mind over and over, and often they question themselves as it could have been another more peaceful solution, and this can heighten stress levels, and again lead to all the symptoms we talked about. Now, this is now magnified because of all the negative press and media, and so people and police officers feel now that they watched more carefully, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly makes them more hesitant and about shooting, and then they feel often somehow judged or maligned by the media when they have had to shoot somebody. Another trigger is serious car accidents where there's fatalities, especially when they're the first on the scene or they have to reconstruct the scene. One of my clients had been an officer doing reconstructive car scenes for at least 30 years. And while he went from one trauma to the next, to the next, to the next, without any particular incident or symptoms. What happened is that there's a cumulative effect. And then it just takes one more small, sometimes, event that completely dysregulates the officer. And this is the most common cause for PTSD amongst law enforcement, is the cumulative effect, because these symptoms can develop over time and they build up. And what happens is that while they're coping on the job, they don't necessarily seek mental health supports and don't often admit that something was very traumatic for them. And they don't think that these constant exposures to trauma will have eventually a permanent effect on them. And so they just get on with the job, and it's very, very stressful. And eventually PTSD sort of manifests itself. But what happens is that by then they're not functioning at all anymore. And so it's much more difficult to treat. Whereas if, as I've often mentioned, if officers would have general mental health checkups every year as part of their duties, then they're more likely to catch the symptoms earlier. And I'll talk a little bit later about what other things can be done about it. So one of the worst outcomes, or the worst outcome, is suicide. And this year there was the Ombudsman report, or last year, and this year over 12 law enforcement officers took their lives in Ontario. And 1 in 4 police officers have contemplated suicide during their career. So for first responders, the rate of suicide for police officers is 4 times higher than other first responders like EMT or fire. And so what happens is that several factors tend to come together to create this perfect storm. And these factors include impulsivity, where either the person acts quickly or without consideration, and there's a method close at hand which they can use, like a gun. And also often alcohol or drugs are involved, which decrease impulse control and lead to impulsive action. The feelings of hopelessness, of pessimism, where the person just no longer believes there can be any positive solution or outcome for them, and they're already emotionally dysregulated, where they're having difficulty controlling. Often you might see it in anger outbursts, not necessarily they're going to discuss feeling depressed or cry, but they might be extremely irritable and aggressive towards others or themselves. And again, once there's a lethal method that they can use, it's very easy to take that decision. And of course, once it's not, if somebody takes pills, sometimes they will stop halfway through, but once you use a gun, then there's no way back. And another factor that is contagion, where people who are already vulnerable learn that of death by suicide of somebody they admire or they know well, and then suddenly it seems like sort of maybe a reasonable alternative, that maybe they should use that. And so there's three really common paths that are considered dangerous and leading to possible self-harm. One of them is acute mental health issues, often associated with substance use disorders. Another path is loss of or diminished access to timely quality care and effective treatment. And the final one is actual or perceived disconnection from family and friends and organizations, which then pushed to the end point, people feel that, you know, there's just nobody cares about them, and people would be better off if they weren't there. And often you hear police officers who are sent home with mental health disorders, and they complain that nobody has called them and nobody is interested in them, and what difference does it make anyway? So those are often the reasons that they will be pushed to end their life, because they feel that it's going to be a relief for them from the pain, but also that maybe nobody else will be that bothered. And sometimes they have a fantasy that by ending their life, they might make people notice. And of course, by the time you are thinking that way, you're not thinking rationally, because of course people may notice and may feel guilty, but you're not going to know about it. And so sometimes you hear people say, well, I'm going to show them how much they hurt me and I'll kill myself. Then of course, it's not going to solve anything at that point. So what's being done? So there was a commission, and the Ontario Ombudsman report, they decided that they would look into helping police officers with PTSD. This was in 2019, and experts from across the country came together and together with the federal government put together a plan. And what they found in this report was that many officers felt betrayed by their supervisors and alienated. As I said, they feel disconnected and not cared about by their peers when they do disclose operational stress injuries. They also feel that there's a lot of suspicion when you take stress leave. And although most people actually don't malinger, there is considerable suspicion that they're taking time off and that they're not really sick or they don't really need it. And for them, they see it as career suicide, because the stigma then is so significant that just makes them feel worse. So if we look at this slide, it's a little busy, but I'll try and go through it. And these are the interventions and the causes. So if you look at A, I don't know if you can all see it, A is mood disorder or other psychiatric disorders. Those are the first things you might see. And then what you would need to do, the first thing they proposed in this report was that you would educate and create awareness with people and have people who are gatekeepers, so that, for example, they go to either the psychologist at their division or the doctor or the nurse or somebody like Tom, who's in the police association. And then you have, if you screen for suicide, so You don't want to be avoiding the question. Sometimes people feel like, well, maybe if I won't mention it, then they won't think about it. But it's actually really important to think about it and to talk about it. And then there's pharmacological treatment, the psychological treatment, there's follow-up care. And again, if you are worried about them, you have to restrict the access to lethal means and take away the use of force. And that, again, makes them feel humiliated and useless. But at this point, if they reach this point, then it has to be done. And now the problem is that there are a lot of media stories, either negative stories or stories about police or other suicides, and you want to try and get the media engaged to possibly report this differently. That's obviously something very difficult to do. But one of the other problems is work-related stress. And for that, again, you need organizational interventions, or this is what the Ombudsman report found anyway. So you need to find a way to mitigate the stress at work. You want to remove barriers to care so that it's easy to get care and you don't have to go through a lot of hoops in order to get the care you need. And you want to make sure that the delivery of care is something that is effective and evidence-based. So these are the kind of things that are under review at the moment in various police organizations to try to reduce the risk of suicide and to reduce the risk of general occupational injury from a mental perspective. So we're now going to look at the risk factors. There's several risk factors for PTSD among police officers. As I said, this is more prevalent, but this is for the general population as well. One of them is other previous traumatic experiences, especially in early life, if they've suffered any sort of bullying or abuse, or there's family history of PTSD and depression, a history of sexual abuse, a history of substance abuse, a history of depression, anxiety, or other mental illnesses, And it's really important to screen for these things. There's also the issue of personality. They found that people there is a correlation between certain kinds of personality. For example, they found that people who tend to be dependent or immature or pathologically narcissistic and can't cope with any sort of rejection or criticism are more prone to PTSD. Gender is a factor. Women tend to suffer more from PTSD. Early parental loss, as I said, these are childhood experiences that are traumatic. And again, there is this myth that if people are calm and collected at the time of the trauma, then this will all come out later. Somehow they're suppressing it and then this bubble will burst. But that's absolutely not the case, according to research. And they find that most people who are cool and calm and collected at the time of the trauma will later manage better than people who cope at the, with extreme symptoms and horror and can't sort of fall apart, and they usually tend to develop PTSD later. So it's not necessarily the case that people who are okay later on they're going to fall apart. So those are the main risk factors, and there are some protective factors as well. So Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist during the Holocaust, who was in a concentration camp. And I recommend all my clients read his book called Man in Search of Meaning, where he talks about his experiences, but he also talks about how to survive them. And he talks, and the main thing he says is that if you can find a meaning to your suffering, you can practically cope with anything. And he also talks about the fact that if you have mutual support or somebody else going through it with you, often you find that, for example, soldiers who are going through some sort of trauma together when they're in the military, they develop less PTSD because it's a joint experience and they don't feel as isolated. So that's one of the protective factors. Another protective factor is taking a more attitude of detached observer, meaning you don't want to be completely dissociated because that then leads to other problems. But if you can somehow take a step back and see this as something that is your job and you're coping with it, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't involve you emotionally. But this is much more difficult to do than to say. Another protective factor is if you feel you have some degree of control over your life, even a small degree. For example, if you can decide which shift you're going to work or which partner you're going to work with on your shift. And very, very important is trust in your leadership and strong group cohesion and feeling that your supervisors are competent to send you out to your calls and that they themselves would be able to do the same call if they had to. Because often I hear police officers saying, I have all these supervisors and they just pen pushers, but they don't really know what it's like in the field and they just sit up there and give instructions. They have no idea what it's really like. And so it's really important that they feel that their supervisors are competent and could do the job if needed, as well as giving them reliable equipment and availability of medical or psychological support. And often I've heard of people, for example, recently one of my police officers had told me about confronting a violent offender in an underground parking lot. But in that parking lot, the radio didn't have, the frequency wasn't working. And so they had no way to contact anybody. So it was just him and his partner having to deal with this situation, which, of course, if you feel that you're not even provided with the best equipment, it already reduces your feeling of being appreciated and valued. And that, again, will lead to difficulties later on. So these are protective factors. The question is then, what happens if people start to decompensate or start to experience symptoms? Do they go for help? And the answer is that most of the time, police officers don't. So when they did a survey, they found that 85% of the respondents said they would avoid disclosing their difficulties to a superior or even a colleague. And 62 said they themselves, they feel that they would be discriminated at work, but they also said that they wouldn't want to work with somebody who had disclosed that they had any mental health issues. So the problem then is that not only do they feel that they don't want to tell anybody, but they also themselves believe that it's a very black and white. So if they feel that it's a very binary situation. If they feel that somebody has mental health issues, that's what they describe, then you're not going to be able to rely on them in a situation of stress. And so they prefer them not to be there. However, if that's the situation, then most people won't disclose when they have any difficulties and therefore will continue working under those pressures. and wait till a point where they can no longer function, which again is leads to much more difficult problems. So basically, talking about emotions is generally unacceptable in police circles. And officers will avoid seeking professional help because they expect to be ostracized, or they expect their weapon to be taken away, or they expect to be passed over for career advancements. And they don't want, often you hear them say, well, is this going to go on record? Because they don't want a history of psychological disorders on their record. And so then they feel that they will be shunned by other officers, which is often the case. And so what happens is that they tend to not report their symptoms, and they also will look unfavorably or not trust officers who do report the symptoms. And they then become disillusioned also because they deal with so much mental health in their job. They also often become disillusioned about mental health because they have often brought acutely mental health people to facilities and shortly afterwards found them back on the street in the same condition, and they tend not to trust the mental health system. And so for them, even somebody with mild problems, they feel like, well, that's risky to have around. And so what if they're on shift with me and they're not going to cope? So even if it's just a mild issue, they prefer to stay away from them. So when combined with the self-stigma and fear of being the one to let the team down, no matter how difficult the problem is, or how mild, they probably won't disclose it, or they will wait till it's much more severe. And the other issue is that officers are trained to be team members and team players, and they will support one another. But what goes on in their own mind when they feel that they're not coping is they just feel, because of their training, that they really should not show any weakness. And so you're either fit for duty or you're not fit for duty. There's nothing in between. And so if I'm not fit for duty, I will lose my identity as a police officer. And that's often a very strong part of who they are. It's not often just a job for them. So something needs to change in order for them to be able to seek help. And the stigma and the misinformation about mental health care and recovery can often lead to judgment by supervisors and others. And so they often won't seek help. And the question is, if they do eventually seek help, then what happens to the access? Because it's often the case especially with WSIB, is that WSIB have recently been much more helpful in that when, for example, we write reports for WSIB, if we say that a police officer fulfills the criteria for PTSD on the DSM, they will get immediate help. However, they feel that they have to still fight for this. So they have to prove it's PTSD. And then if it's not PTSD, or if it's, for example, depression or anxiety or something else, they're not going to get immediate help. And so often PTSD is overdiagnosed because that's the quickest path to get psychological assistance and get a WSIB claim number. The other concern is that, again, if you close down other paths, then you're not going to get help. So they find that they not only have to overcome their own stigma, but they now have to fight WSIB claims, and this often just exacerbates their symptoms. So it becomes much more difficult for them to access help. But again, this is something that, as I showed you the slide with the ombudsman report, this is something that's being worked on in various levels of the police force. Another issue is that when they do go for help, they are, as I said, not always referred to people who have trauma-related training. And while a lot of, if you ask most clinicians, do you treat trauma? They will say yes, but often they're not trained to treat trauma. So these are questions which I would suggest when you are referring your clients for help, that they ask the therapist who's going to be seeing them. So they want to know if they're licensed, because as you know, there's a lot of people in the field who are not licensed, who have done a few weekend courses and coaching or various things, Reiki. And I'm not saying that these things don't have a place, they're not treatment for post-traumatic stress. So if somebody is licensed, it's more likely that they've had some training at least. And then you want to know what kind of training, did they have specific post-traumatic stress training? And what is their orientation? Because if it's more psychodynamic, that might take several years of treatment. If it's more cognitive behavioral, that would be more current and dealing with the here and now. You want to know how many clients they've treated with PTSD, because if you have severe PTSD, you don't want to be the first one that they're treating. And is their treatment evidence-based? And what is their particular specialty? And you want to make sure that they continue with training and not have trained 20 years ago when, for example, it was thought that it's a good idea to keep bringing up the trauma and talk about it again and again and again in detail, which recently the evidence suggested that actually re-traumatizes people. And so you want to make sure that the clinician is up to date with their research. And the other thing is that when you are working with first responders, there's a lot of pressure, both from WSIB and from the police officers themselves, to get back to work. However, there is a bit of a catch-22, because they often can't get back immediately to frontline policing, and so they're often put on what's called a desk job. Now, some desk jobs can be quite meaningful, but some report that they just sort of, a pencil pusher, and they find that this is even more humiliating and affects their dignity, and they feel that nobody really respects them anymore and feels they can't really do anything, so they just sort of parked somewhere. And so the research has found that the return to work is one of the greatest times of risk, because what happens is there's a lot of decision making that goes into returning to modified duties. And it's very, very stressful for individuals and their families and their co-workers to provide a job that is meaningful. And often what happens is they might go back to work and either be put back in a job that they're not ready for, or the opposite, put back in a very meaningless job. But then their condition actually worsens, which is a much high risk situation, and can often lead to self-harm. So these are the most frequent risk points for police members with mental health issues, and especially in situations where there's a lot of negative media surrounding the issue that they were involved in. And so you want to make sure that they are well supported and well directed when they return to work, because again, this is one of the most significant areas of risk for them. So there's various kinds of treatment. I'm just gonna stop this share for a second, and I'm gonna show you a very short video of people talking about what it was like for them to access treatment. I hope this works.
It's not easy
I
going.
hope you can hear it.
Tell
If you can't.
Hannah, can you start it again? We just lost the sound.
Oh, sorry.
Yep, yep.
Okay, let me know if you can hear it.
No, the sound,
No?
yeah.
No sound. Okay. We'll have to, no. Okay. No, no. Okay, so you can't hear this one? No. Okay.
No, we didn't. Maybe we'll come up with a solution later to have a posting.
Yeah,
or
I'll
listing
send the
somewhere.
link. So I'll just send the link.
Yep, and if you could put that in the chat
Yeah.
there, Hannah, that would be great.
Okay, I'll do that. So let me just go back to the screen share. Okay, we'll go back to here. Okay, so basically it's a video, and I'll send you the link later, just talking, police officers talking about what it was like for them to seek treatments, just 5 minutes, but it's quite interesting. So there's various kinds of treatments, and some what's called trauma-focused psychotherapy, and those are things like post-traumatic CBT for PTSD. It's CBT that's specifically geared towards people suffering from post-traumatic stress and looks at the way people perceive their trauma. So again, it's not about going over the trauma in detail. Often we don't even discuss the trauma itself. Sorry? Oh? Oh. So what happens is that it's more about how they cope with the trauma and their thoughts and feelings about the trauma. That's where the emphasis lies in trauma-focused psychotherapy. There is prolonged exposure, and that is more to do with exposing and people to triggers to their post-traumatic stress or their anxiety, and then teaching them techniques to ground themselves, and so that they can stay in that situation without avoiding it, as people tend to do with PTSD. And that requires building a hierarchy of stressors from the least to the worst. And you work with clients to sort of get them to feel that they are in control of the pace, so that they're not going to be sort of ambushed and pushed into a situation where they will re-experience trauma and then be worse off. So you have to do this very, very gently and very carefully. But if you do it right, then they will feel empowered to stop, to control their anxiety while they're exposed to it. EMDR is another technique, and basically that's about processing memories and thoughts and feelings related to trauma. And here too, often we don't discuss the actual details of the trauma. It's more about their memory or perception or feeling about the trauma. And often we find that when you are able to process one trauma, it will sort of trickle down to other traumatic memories. Because what happens in PTSD is that the memories are stored in a very sort of jumbled and disorganized way in the amygdala part of the brain, which is the emotional fear center of the brain. And if you think of it like a library, and so the trauma is just sort of shoved into some shelf there, not in like in files. And if the files are not organized, when there's a trigger, what happens is the amygdala is like activated and then shuts down. So it's as if you have two radio stations. The amygdala is blaring the music and sending up all these images and flashbacks. It's as if you pulled out that file and all the papers just went everywhere. And your frontal lobe, which is more about thinking, planning, making decisions, the volume there is turned very low. And so while it's not that you can't think, but your brain has been hijacked by all these triggers. And so in EMDR, what you're trying to do is you're trying to sort of build a bridge between your frontal lobe, your decision-making, and the amygdala so that this file can be organized and turned into a narrative. And it's not triggered unexpectedly from nothing. You just think, oh my, I don't even know what I saw. I've got all these flashbacks. I can't cope. And then they just want to escape. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to get them to the point where it is a memory. They're never going to erase the memory, but it doesn't hijack the brain. There's also been recent experiments with MDMA, which is ecstasy, ketamine, LSD, psilocybin, like magic mushrooms, and they have found some success for PTSD with those, particularly when they're in conjunction with therapy. You don't want to just send someone off and give them some LSD by themselves. So these are the main treatments that are now available for post-traumatic stress. So that is basically all the issues that I wanted to cover in terms of the diagnosis, the treatment, triggers, and the help available. And these are the references. I will send them to you when I send I'll send this PowerPoint to Jennifer and she can distribute it. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, just for you, Hannah, I'm looking into the chat there and everybody's mentioning some movies like Valley of Allah and the Bradley Cooper movie, American Sniper, for classic stuff there for the military peeps. I know we have some first responders on the line here and people who've treated first responders there. I'll give them a chance to ask some questions or make some comments. We do have some time there, so pop in there, people, either raise your hand or...
I'm gonna stop the share because
go ahead, and you can probably see the screen better yourself there. So if anybody wants to pop in there, feel free there. And especially around the treatment there and the people that are in the treatment facilities, I've noticed sent a lot of people to treatment facilities, they do well, but a lot of people do well just doing the one-on-one with the clinical psychologists like Hannah. And what people don't realize, Hannah's also a neuropsychologist there. So that's kind of a more scientific level there. So if anybody wants to pop in, go ahead, unmute yourself or put up your hand. A few comments there. We got lots of time. Don't be shy.
I know it was a lot of information I threw at you all at once, but I really wanted to give you an overview of everything and then any of the subjects, I'm sure you can look into more yourselves as well.
Okay, go ahead, Christine. Can you unmute yourself there? See your hand up.
Thanks. I really loved your presentation, Hannah. I am kind of fascinated. You said something that I just wanted to let you know kind of helps me. I'm not a police officer, but I've worked in the field of death and dying for over 20 years. My first deployment was 9/11. And I'm a humanitarian is what I really like to call myself. And I had awful dreams about my daughter. I had my daughter when I was 40. My job took me away, so I have two older children. And I finally got the guts to share with my husband what my dream was about. And I always correlated it with my daughter. But after listening to you just say that one thing where you said, usually when it's something to involve children, my main focus is working in death and dying with children. And I couldn't figure out why I had a connection to the baby I just had. So when I jumped into my career, my youngest two were actually older. But then when I entered back in and after having the third child, I think that's kind of what threw those dreams off for me. So I took the tech, I went into the tech one, the over tech use, and she's like, if you sleep with the TV on, but I sleep with the TV on to drown out my dream. And it always seems to be a recurring dream. So I really appreciate that. But I work in inspiring and helping people learn from their lived experiences. So one of the questions I had is, what's your thought on exposure therapy? I tried it on myself, and I found going back and living some of the things that happened to me, i.e. my brother falling over the falls, things like that, gave me better closure, and I understood the trauma better. Where when I tried to recall it, like you mentioned, I only recalled the most horrifying pieces and then couldn't put the story together. But once I went back and exposed myself, obviously with the help of someone else, it all made sense. Do you recommend exposure therapy, or do you think that's just like, because a lot of people just think you're going to re-traumatize, you're going to scare the crap out of this person?
Well, that's why I think, it's first really important to have a proper assessment. So not all treatments are going to be for all people, right? So, for some people, they're missing bits of information, and often they'll say to me, oh, if I just don't know what happened. I just want to know what happened. I feel like this part it's missing, and that is really bugging me. So sometimes for some people it helps, like I said, to make a full narrative which they can understand and then visit it, because rather than it coming at them in like bits and pictures and smells, and like I said, like a file that you take out and all the pages just fly everywhere. If you can put it in order, then it's not going to make you less sad if you lost somebody, for example, but you will be able to think about it without feeling like it's consuming you or hijacking your ability to think. So for some people, exposure is the right, and it is a treatment, but you really need to see, for example, if you start doing treatment with somebody, and even when they're just telling you about the trauma, they haven't even told you the whole story, they're already disassociating, and you can see that they're not really with you. They're already like their mind is shut. Their brain is somehow protecting them from telling you. So their brain is like somewhere else. They're not telling you. For example, if they were abused, for example, and some therapists want them to tell them in detail about the abuse, and that just completely shuts them down. This is not the person you want to do exposure with, because they cannot tolerate that level of memory and stimulation about. So for that kind of person, you want to work more with the feelings about themselves in the trauma, not specifically what happened to them. So it really depends.
I tend to give them tasks to do. And then I also encourage them to write books. I own a publishing company. So the best part I want everybody's story. And so I would love people to share their story, especially at this conference, because there's so many great stories that can be compiled into a book that so many other people would learn. My hardest problem, though, is that I am not a counselor. I'm more of a coach. So I will get the people that won't go see the counselor, or they're like, I'm not going to see a shrink. So I try to walk the journey with them and try to introduce them to other people I know that have had that PTSD, that have seeked out help, and then be like, well, we can go together. I loved your presentation. It was great.
Thank you. But that's why I think sometimes, when groups are a bit easier for those kind of people, because they don't feel like the weird one going for therapy, right? Because there's a bunch of people who are like them. So we try to do the groups very homogeneous, like all police officers or military or something, or first responders, so that they don't think like, oh my God, I'm going to be with people who don't even know what this is like, or the public, or I'm going to be confronted with somebody arrested, or, so, but I agree with you. And again, I think it's very individual. And, for some people, just telling the story is not is too much. It's just
Yeah.
too much. And so, you need to meet them where they can cope. Otherwise, you don't want to make them worse, of course. But thank you for that. And and from what it sounds like by the time you had your third child, you'd lived a whole life of trauma. So of course you're going to be much more vigilant about trauma, right?
Well, and I never understand that, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this. Every time I go to New York, people want to take me to where the Twin Towers are. They want to show me a gravesite. And I'm always like, why do you want to do this to me all the time? And I think it's all my New York friends think I want to re-experience something. And I think, I don't really want to re-experience this. And I was in New York City on a vacation, and I turned to my husband and said, I want another baby. And now in hindsight, I realized why I wanted another. I was standing on a street corner having a breakdown going, oh my gosh, what did I do? And so what did I think? Let's have a baby. And then it happened. But I just think that it's so funny how it hits you. And then afterwards, on hindsight, you're like, oh, that makes sense. A whole lot of people died here. So I thought, heck, let's get pregnant. So
reaffirming life, right?
Exactly. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
And Hannah, there's a couple of comments in the question there. Yeah, okay. About other like firefighters might have the same stigma, different level there. But our profession, policing and the military, we're one of the few professions where we're trained to take somebody's life, and authorized under law there. But anyways, there's a good comment there by Blair. Exposure therapy without the guidance of a trained therapist, you just can't do it on your own. You need somebody. You need to be seeing somebody there. Maybe. But anyways, if you want to talk to those two comments, that's fine there. And maybe.
Yeah, I see also.
We still got some time. Go ahead.
I can see a comment here that a lot of people are being afraid of being judged or losing their job, and that's exactly one of the main problems that we hear a lot. So they often won't go, and Tom knows this, to the police psychologist because it's too close to work, and so they'd rather often go to somebody who isn't associated with the police. And I have often advocated, but I don't know if it's been implemented yet, but I also often think that the best thing would be to make every single police officer have one session a year with a psychologist so that everybody goes. So nobody knows if they're going because they're actually suffering or they're just going because it's their yearly thing. But I don't know if it's been implemented, maybe there's no money at it. But you're right, that's what they're scared of. They're scared of being judged and losing their job. And you're right, Tara was saying that there's a lot of shame. Absolutely, shame is one of the most prevalent feelings because you feel like I've let my team down, I've let myself down. What kind of person am I? I wanted to be a police officer and I can't even cope now. Like, what's wrong with me? And that is again something that we work on reducing the stigma of mental health. And I think with COVID, it might have helped a little because so many people now have more anxiety and depression that it's much more common. It's not like something so rare. So that might help. But it's true that they do think they have to be strong. It's very difficult to seek help when you're seen as the hero all the time, right? So,
just looking around, see if does anybody else have any other questions there before we wrap things up. We do have some time.
I just want to comment. There's a few comments about alcohol, which is a huge problem. And what happens is that's one of the ways to cope, right? Because there's an incident, and then everybody goes for a drink together. They go, "Oh, you okay? Yeah, you're okay. Okay, let's just have a drink." And often and then they continue drinking at all, which doesn't help. So, and so somebody was saying here that, in the military, there was a fear of being released from the military due to their illness. And in Bosnia, the commanding officer encouraged the senior ranking officers to discourage junior ranks not to report the medical. Exactly, that's the problem. Everybody's scared that if they say they're suffering, I can't tell you how many people I see that are terrified of what people will say when they get back to work, and they don't want to go back because they're scared of what people are going to say. But then it's sort of a catch-22, because how can they go back if they won't feel supported there? And yeah.
Yep, we got a question there. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I work in residential treatment. We have a number of people that are coming in with varying degrees of trauma, not always PTSD, but varying degrees of trauma. And one of the things that we had some training at Christmas that we had to instill in the staff to understand the fact that pretty much the first year, if somebody's dealing with a substance abuse issue around their trauma, the first year, basically you're in a stabilization mode. You just need to stabilize them, because you'll get some people, well-meaning or whatever, that kind of want to dig into the trauma, which is absolutely the worst thing that you could possibly do, especially in a short-term residential like we have. You got them for 19 days. Do not, don't, my term is don't pick scabs off sores. You're not going to be around to help heal. Right, because all you're going to do is just send them out raw out the door. So,
absolutely,
yeah. Recognize the trauma. Don't dismiss it or minimize it. Recognize it, but understand that this is part of a process where you will get to there, and so that we don't kind of stir up the hornet's nest, because they'll get nothing out of the treatment we are trying to provide. So that was a big thing for us, is to learn, guys, this is stabilization at this point. But also to let the client know this is stabilization. We're not minimalizing or dismissing your trauma. We're just saying there is a point in this process where you will look at that more effectively. This just isn't that point, because we got to get you emotionally stabilized in today before we worry about that.
100%. I mean, there's no point in sort of opening the box, Pandora's box, and I say, okay, well, we're done now. Our time is up. That's the worst thing. Yeah, for sure. You want to make sure that they leave the office more stable than when they came in. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I see somebody wrote about difficulties encountered by women police officers. Christine, do you want to say a little bit more about that? I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Unmute. I'm actually not a police officer, and I didn't say that. Is there someone?
No. It's Christine McMillan.
Another Christine? Oh,
yes.
There she is.
Yeah, but she's on mute. You have to
unmute Christine.
I'm unmuted. Okay.
There we are.
I make the comment. I meant to say a bit more, but how are women feeling about this issue for themselves personally, while they're living in a work atmosphere that appears to be somewhat, quotes, macho, to find I can't find a better word at this point, but what are some of the issues they're dealing with?
Well, first of all, women generally suffer more from PTSD, but women have an added layer because they also suffer harassment at work and sort of some sexual humiliation, and so that's another layer. And so they don't want police officers to look down and say, oh, you're just being hysterical, you're a woman. I mean, it was hard enough for women to get into police in the first place. So now, as women, we don't want to be like, well, we can't cope with this, right? So it's very difficult. And again, I think one of the biggest ways to address this is for people to have really supportive, because groups, and I know from a lot of the police officers I work with, is that they used to have more of a team. So it would be the same sort of unit, or you'd have the same partner, but now they change a lot. And so that's very difficult to create trust. So, but in cases where people feel supported and contained and understood, then the trauma is dealt with better. they have less symptoms. I think for women, there's an added difficulty of how they're perceived, and they feel they have to show even less symptoms.
And I'm just looking at one more question there. Marie, Marie, did you want to speak to that there, or did you just want it's because there's some other questions flying by there. I didn't want to miss that. Marie, did you want to unmute to speak to that, or? There we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Go ahead. Marie.
Hi. I just want to thank you, Hannah, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I just, from working in the past in the police department, I noticed that as one of the biggest sort of blockings going back to work was the sanctuary trauma for the officers when they thought they would have the support of the department. And I found that it was incredibly frustrating for them to try to even return, and they regressed often trying to deal with them, and then coming back and then having to face, charges from IA or whatever. And it was just like, it just was a cascading, it was a disaster. Yeah. And I just wondered, like, if anything has even gotten better with regards to that. And it's so unfortunate. I'm dealing with all of the paperwork in WSIB and hear the horror stories.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. And that's such an important point, because I can tell you without a doubt that the number one theme that comes up with PTSD or any other mental health issue is the feeling of betrayal, shame, being cast out, being rejected, not being part of the brotherhood anymore, or not even having a brotherhood. Or they say, like, it's a myth, this brotherhood, because here I am on my own, no one's calling me. And this is the number one factor, in my opinion, that exacerbates the issue. If they felt totally supported, then, or they felt that people, the fact that the media is also negative at the moment, they feel, so they don't have support from their superiors. They now don't have support from the public, because now they, being chastised all the time, and people saying, police officers should be defunded and all this stuff. And so they feel that no one, like, why am I doing this job? Why would I put my life on the line? What for? Nobody appreciates it. And then when I do get sick, everyone leaves me or puts me down. And then, they always say, oh, I bet they're talking about me. And you see people who have been in the police force for 35 years and, always been strong and so on. And that is when they fall apart, they leave, and they just drink themselves to death. They still don't deal with the issue, but admitting, and even those people are the ones who will sort of say to the younger police officers, oh, come on, don't be such a wuss, pick yourself up. I've been through worse, whatever they say. But it's, if this could be addressed, this would be a huge help. And I mean, if, for example, in the Israeli Defense Force, which I was part of, it's not that there isn't PTSD, there is, but there is less PTSD. And one of the reasons is because there's a real sense of purpose, because you feel like 10 kilometers away from you, your family is living, and you are in a war, because if you're not dead, your family will be killed. So there's a real sense of purpose and meaning. B, you're all in it together. So you're all in this trauma together, and then you leave together, and you are sort of like in this group, and you talk about how awful it was, and sort of debrief and that sort of thing. And so you feel there's a purpose to it, and also there's huge appreciation from the military. So, just like after Vietnam, when the vets came back and people were so dismissive of them, and that absolutely made PTSD and all the mental health problems 10 times worse, because they came back to just shame and and disdain. So if this issue can be somehow addressed, and I believe there's efforts, it's just a different changing culture is not easy. So,
Thank you.
Okay, well, I know we're starting to wind down here, Hannah, and people might want to break or so. Does anybody else have any questions or something they want to go before we wind down for a last minute question there? Where we got Hannah here, and raise your hand now or a little comment there, or forever hold your peace, I guess. And we'll just give it 2 seconds there. Okay, 3. And okay, Hannah, I think that's it. Thank you very much for making
okay,
yourself
thank you
available there.
guys.
Hannah, I'll see you at our next session. I do my clinical supervision with Hannah there. She's a great person and a great resource for me. And thank you all. And thank you very much, Hannah, for being here. Let's give Hannah a little virtual hand. I guess
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
Okay.
for my trial of fire, my first Zoom presentation. So that was good. And don't forget, we are now recruiting for our groups. So if you have anybody who you think is suitable, send them our
Yeah, the
email and I'll send you all the
spousal
information.
group, yeah. And people can
Spousal
contact,
or couples.
yeah, they can contact me about that too, and I'll give them the information
Okay.
there.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you very much,
Thank
Hannah. I'll
you,
let you log
guys.
off, and it
Okay.
will, when you log off, it will end the session. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.